I went to seminary and I decided that it was important for me to save the world, but I wasn't going to do that in the church, so I went to get a degree in sociology because I figured they knew how to save everybody, and turned out they didn't know much either. When I got to Chicago, I ended up at the Center for Urban Affairs at Northwestern University. And at the time, you remember, there was a war in Vietnam going on. Martin Luther King had just been assassinated. And then there were these people in the neighborhoods, led by this woman named Gail Sincata, who were talking about this thing called redlining and discrimination.
We were told sometimes we weren't nice, but we said bad housing isn't nice. And don't anybody in a three-piece suit dare to tell us what's nice.
They had this peculiar notion that rather than start with the experts, you should start with people in the community to understand what's going on. And they explained to me that I could sit in the back of the room, and if they needed me, they'd ask for me. That I wasn't going to save them, they were going to save themselves. We began to look at these issues, and although none of us coming out of seminary knew much of anything about even how to make a loan, we were the research team hired to do all the reports for the Governor's Commission on Mortgage Practices and Redlining, so we had to learn fast. I went to appraisal school, and one of the wonderful things about being a student in a school is the teachers assume you're one of them. So the appraisers told me all about how you exploit FHA to screw the people in the black neighborhoods. We became the experts rather rapidly. It was terrifying to think we were the experts because we knew we didn't know much, but we also realized we were the experts. So you had in Chicago this direct input to the Senate. You had in Chicago direct input from the community base that was the center of the country, really. The National People's Action came from Chicago and was the center of that. And then you brought in people from all over the country, state banks from the upper Midwest and people from Minnesota, and they were all partners. And neighborhood people were partners, and legal aid people were partners, and civil rights groups. You all got to be part of it.
In that number, when NPA goes marching in.
When they forced their way in, as they did for every single chairman of the Federal Reserve Board to meet with them and tell them what needed to be done, they brought the leaders from around the country, not the staff people. I was lucky enough to go to the first one with Volcker, and he had his economists at one end of the table, and Gail had her community people, and they all talked about the economy in words no one understood for a while. And then they started explaining how business worked in Detroit and what happened in the inner city in Chicago. And by the end of the meeting, his economists were taking notes because they began to understand they didn't really understand how things worked in the real world. And that's the way it is now. I think the belief Woodstock has now is that you don't do anything that isn't something you do with the communities. You know, you don't do research for the sake of research. The research has to move policy along. And it's filling a gap that our country desperately needs, is to have things rise from the neighborhoods, because no one understands their lives like they do. You have to have confidence that the people you work with in the community, they are the leaders. And I think if our brilliant young people do that, they can make real change.